Good morning. Long time no see.
Yeah, indeed.
I just want to say, first of all, before we get started, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Congratulations on your latest release. And, it seems like since the last time we talked, this experiment has just started to get a little bit more efficient as time has gone on. And I feel like,
Oh yeah.
wow, I'm really excited to have you get back because the groove is in place now. Like everything is kind of established a little bit, whereas before it felt like I was kind of fumbling my way through everything. So also thank you for that. You put up with me in like episode 8 of this thing, which is amazing. So let's talk about Head of a Gorgon, which I must say, I mean, it kind of took me aback because it's such a powerful work and it's so beautiful. And obviously, we're going to talk at length about it. But holy shit, well done. This is just a great piece of work. Now that this is out in the world, because this has been with you for so long. And from what I gather, you've been working on this for about 10 years or so. And correct me if I'm wrong. What is the feeling that you're left with as this has gone into the world for the last couple of months?
Thank God it's done. Oh my God. Like, yeah. And it was actually more than a decade, but it's like, oh,
Sure.
just thank God. Like, so it's funny because I guess in some respects, I don't, I don't know that many writers think of it like I do, but I have just a couple projects that I sort of feel like I want this out in the world, or at least out of me
Yeah.
before I die.
Yeah, for sure.
And this was one. My memoir is the other. If I never write after that again, which I doubt, but if I don't, like, I don't have any like high priority like death projects
Mm.
like must accomplish like before I die.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully the universe will allow this and not strike me down before.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a huge sense of just relief. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I there comes a point in time, especially when you work on a project this long, where you just really want to be done. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not I mean, I didn't want to rush it because of the subject matter
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of the subject matter, and really wanting to do it justice and do my best to get it right, at least from my perspective and experience, as best I could. But at a certain point, like, you just got to be done. Like, I
Right.
can't keep doing this
Yeah.
forever.
And what's that
And
stopping point? That really is the curious thing of this whole thing is there's more in there. I'm sure there's more pieces that are coming together to want to add more to this piece, but at what point did you say this is enough for what this is?
it's funny that you mentioned that, because I know for some writers, they really do feel like what you're talking about. Like, they finish a book and then they feel like, oh, they had these extra pieces that
Yeah.
they wish they could have included. And sometimes they release like later editions, especially if it's like ebook, you can do that. I actually don't have that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I and it probably does have something to do with the fact that I just spent so much time on it.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't like so there's the urgency to, like, I want to get this book out there before I die, but not
Yeah.
the urgency to rush the story from my end, and to like I really wanted and needed in many ways to sit with it and let the pieces kind of reveal themselves to me, which doesn't mean that I'll never write about sexual violence again, but to say that I really do very much feel that this story is complete. And I think in large part it is because I took the time to just let it simmer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's sort of, I guess, my end result.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you because as I read this, and thank you for sending me that copy, I was just so relieved to be able to take a look at it before we did the interview because the structure of this thing is just beautiful. And I say this as a playwright, screenwriter, somebody who just loves structure so much. The thing is just built in such a way that we follow it chronologically. There's this beautiful forward motion to it, but at the same time, it seems like you are giving these pieces of trauma and memory and persons a shape. Whereas, I mean, the way that I kind of imagine some of these things, having gone through difficult experiences might be akin to having fragments of something. And then as you're putting it together, it's like, oh, this is the way that it needs to be presented. It needs to be a beginning, middle, and end, because a lot of folks, I imagine, and you'll have to kind of help me out with that if you think that that's something that you may have perceived before. It needed a shape like that, with that kind of beginning, middle, and end. Is that too far from what you originally started with?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that's pretty accurate, as far as what I was trying to shape. So one of the benefits of taking a myth and sort of reimagining it, is that you can bring parts of your truth and parts of real life, but then you also get the distance of creating something that's fiction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this book very much is a melding of, you know, nonfiction and fiction, of, memory, whether my own, other people's, experiences, and then, just this wholly created thing. And by taking that approach, you have a sort of distance that I think allows you to, at least for me
Mm-hmm.
anyway, kind of look at overall story as not so close to you that you can't really shape it in a way that makes it more accessible. And for me, the accessibility, I mean, as far as poetry goes, there's always that question of, is this really accessible, and how accessible can you really make poetry?
Mm-hmm.
But because I have that fiction background, and because I read Anne Carson's autobiography of Red, and that really influenced this work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a novel in verse. I really felt like that sort of narrative arc could really benefit people who don't normally read poetry, to be guided through a poetry collection in a way that makes sense and is familiar to them. And that's what that narrative arc provides.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I hope that I accomplish that goal of making the poetry more accessible for people, because it really is intended for survivors who are at a certain point in their own healing and recovery, not somebody who's just been traumatized, because this will not
Sure.
be a
Yeah.
positive experience,
Right.
which is why the trigger warning is there in the physical copy, has a trigger warning. Which you'll see once it finally does arrive. But yeah, I mean, I think that just overall, that sort of marrying of the fact and fiction helped me kind of create a distance to be able to create a story that more or less didn't traumatize me in creating it,
Right.
and then also build a story that is hopefully more accessible, because it has a narrative arc for people who are not typically readers of poetry.
Hmm. And I think you were very, very successful with that, because one of the things that I learned as after our first interview, where you introduced me to so many wonderful poets, and really, like, my education started, proper education, when I interviewed you, because you just connected me with so many new poets and new work to read, that I learned how you were a disciple of Louise Gluck, um, a little bit, and it makes sense
Oh, it's
because
so true.
it feels
Yeah.
like your text has that level of approachability, and there's also this sense that it's not poetic for the sense of being poetic. It is what the words need to be, and no more than that. Austere in the right way. I just was so taken by the way that you could talk about these things without pushing anyone away from what was happening in these words.
Hmm. Well, I mean, well, first off, thank you for the kind words, and I'm glad that you found like any of my ramblings helpful. I'm always grateful when people find like anything that I do helpful. It's like, oh, okay, like I
It
didn't
was
completely
awesome.
like you know blow it for this person. That's good.
Yeah.
Um, you know, just as as much as like there's an enthusiasm like coming from you and the kind words that you've shared about this work, I think that there are still people who would look at this and be completely like, no, like
Mm-hmm.
just alienated from it,
Mm-hmm.
or just they don't want to access what's happening, and they, for whatever reason, it may be
Sure.
like self-protection, it may be like complete sexism and misogyny. I mean, there's a spectrum, right?
Sure.
um but my hope was that, my approach would resonate with readers, but I also acknowledge, like, it's not going to resonate with everybody. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think anybody's work ever really does.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, certainly there are more popular writers whose work resonates with a broader majority. But I mean, like, even Stephen King, like, there are people who don't like Stephen King. Like, I mean, there's always going to be somebody out there who, it just like your words, your syntax, your style, your whatever, just like your vibe, your aesthetic just doesn't work for
Exactly.
them.
Yeah.
And I don't have any control over that. Um, I have uh, spent a lot of time trying to make my work the work that I want to read, and also hope that in doing that, the folks who maybe sort of think like me or are drawn to similar aesthetics as I am are going to connect with that the same way. Again, like, my primary audience for this ideally is fellow survivors. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot of, in fact, I've been reading a lot of other people's work over the years, but especially lately, like within the past, I want to say like 6 months or so,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm planning something. I have something in the works
Mm-hmm.
for April. Uh, so I've been kind of familiarizing myself with other and refamiliarizing in many ways, because, like I said, I've been reading this type of work. Whenever I've found collections or even individual poems, I've really devoured it. And a lot of times, what I feel like I'm seeing or experiencing from writers who are specifically writing from the experience of like they basically said, like, yes, I identify as a survivor, and this is maybe not the actual experience, but I'm basing this work off of experiences that I myself have had. There's almost like this sort of like coding that
Mm-hmm.
seems to go into this type of work. And as I read that sort of work and I see how those things are sort of built in there, the way I'd like to think that that I've done something similar, and that's what I'm picking up on in other people's work
Mm-hmm.
as I'm reading it. But that sort of like almost like coded like language or coded experience, that if you've it's like being part of a like an inside
It's a secret
kind of,
handshake that you're talking
yeah,
about.
sort of like
Yeah.
that, exactly.
Yeah.
And I like I said, there are some things in my book that are there for people who maybe kind of have experienced it, and maybe are more thorough or like deeper diver readers, like
Mm.
maybe somebody who regularly reads poetry and has a maybe deeper like fundamental understanding than somebody who like has never picked up a book of poetry before. But I that's what I'm noticing, and it's been really interesting to kind of pick up on that sort of. It's not a common experience from the perspective of, like, we each have our own like unique experiences, but the coding of some of the experiences and sort of the layers that sort of go up, like when I read other people's work now, is very interesting to me, and I see this common sort of approach.
Mm.
as it were.
Yeah. Do you think it relates sort of to the idea, not just in the language itself, but in the sort of distance that has to happen in the work, like you were mentioning before, by using the myth as sort of like um, a device, if you will, you kind of remove yourself a little bit. Do you think it has something to do with that kind of idea where the author has to create the language using that device to tell you about something through the work? I mean, I don't know if I'm explaining myself right on that, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I get what you're saying, and I can't. I mean, I can't speak for why other writers do the things they do, and that may very well be it for some other folks. Like I see a lot of people who write about this and are survivors. I feel like that work is very much more direct. Like
mhm,
it doesn't necessarily kind of, I mean, not always, but it doesn't necessarily meld with this concept of myth or like,
mhm,
fairy tale folklore, kind of like melding these two things together in order to create sort of like a separately existing narrative from the personal experience. Um, I think there's always a distance between the actual writer and the speaker or narrator. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And so that may also be playing a part. But also, I think, at least for me, the the sort of like, it's kind of hard to put words to.
mhm,
I guess like the experiences are something that there's like this, usually, I mean, again, I can't speak for everybody's actual experiences, but usually there's this sort of like secretive kind of component, right? Like, so predators rely on their victims' secrecy,
mhm,
right? And I think in maybe some kind of weird way, maybe there's an element of that. And again, I only want to speak for myself on this because
uh-huh,
I don't understand and can't speak for other people's approaches. But
sure,
I think that they're like, when somebody, I like from a lighter perspective,
yeah,
as soon
yeah,
as somebody like tells you like, oh hey, can you keep a secret?
mm,
Or like, hey, okay, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody else,
mhm,
right? What's the first thing that you want to do? You want to go and tell somebody
right. It's like a ticking
somehow.
time bomb.
Some
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. And so I think maybe in some weird psychological way, and again, I'm only speaking for myself here,
mhm,
maybe in some weird psychological way, it's like the second that somebody says like you need to keep a secret, your mind starts thinking of ways to reveal that secret
mm,
without
yeah,
revealing the secret.
right,
And maybe that's what I'm trying to say or like communicate with respect to this sort of like coding. It's like, I know a person is telling me something, but they're telling it to me in such a way that it's not direct, and it's almost like you have to speak the language, or you
right,
have to know like the secret handshake in
yeah,
order to be able to fully access um what's really going on here, if
absolutely.
that makes
Yeah, yeah, because at that point it seems like the work has to operate on two completely different levels. At least, again, this is one perspective, so not to encompass any or codify the way that this kind of work works. But at least from your experience, it seems like the work had to operate on those two levels in a way.
I mean, I don't know if it had to. I just know that it did, it
Well,
did
well,
for
maybe
me.
organically it came to be that way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think for me, an important part of this narrative is this idea or this concept that there the predator does, predators, at least in the case of Head of a Gorgon, they do demand secrecy. They do demand, and so then as a survivor, you're constantly pushing back against that in some way.
Hmm.
And like the opening of the book, the beginning section of the book, where Medusa is revealing these things, like the rock that's there
Hmm.
in plain view,
Oh
and
man.
the things that go over the name and the notebook.
Yeah.
There are these ways that the survivor is revealing what has happened and what continues to happen.
Hmm.
um that's an important part, because I think too,
Yeah.
if you're coming at this collection and you have suspicions about something happening in, like let's say you're an adult and you're reading this, and you've always kind of gotten a weird vibe. I'm not saying, like, look, I'm not saying like use my book to, like, you know
Yeah. To
seek out or
sniff
something
out.
like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Right. That's not, but I think that, making sense of some of the things that you see or experience, depending on the perspective you're coming from at that early age. Like, I
Hmm.
look back and I'm like, oh my God, like that person, like
Yeah.
totally
Yeah.
experienced this. Like,
Right.
and now it's like, it's all kind of because of that, those, I'm revealing the secret, but I'm not telling you the secret.
Hmm.
I'm revealing it in this other way. And I think that's a really important kind of
Right.
component for people to be aware of, for various reasons. Again, not, you're not going to like go and like do your own SVU.
Hmm.
But that kind of awareness,
Hmm.
I think, can help people kind of, make sense of some things,
Right.
whether it's in their own life or other people's lives. What they do with that greater awareness is not up to me. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting vigilantism or anything
Sure.
like
Sure.
that.
But I think,
Um,
yeah.
I'm,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
I
ahead.
think, yeah, no, just being able to kind of better understand maybe what some of this stuff actually means,
Hmm.
and that this is an important component of the experience. Um, and doing with, like, just greater awareness, again, like
Right.
raising awareness about these experiences,
Right.
and bringing this work to survivors in the hopes that, it can help them.
Hmm.
Those are my goals.
Yeah, and I think you did that so remarkably well. But you just identified why the poem "The Collector," out of most of them, for me, was the one that stood out in my mind because of those very things that you were saying, and I guess the tangibleness of that situation and the detail of something, that might be, I don't know if it's innocuous is the word, but like just a rock, and
Mhm.
putting it in plain sight. I mean, that is such a vivid moment that stands out in the work, but with the context that you've added with the rest of the poem, I mean, and the where it belongs in this whole book, I mean, for me is just one of my favorites and one of the revelations because of what it does for the whole collection. But at the beginning, one of the things that I just want to comment on real quick is the establishing of the themes and the visuals throughout the whole thing that you're working with throughout the whole thing. Um, there is a kind of betrayal, and obviously, like transformation is a big part of the piece. But do you feel like, in particular with water, it just seemed to be the thing that the water was the element that is there for you to give you life, but then there is a turn to that visual, and it takes on a different form. I'm curious how you began to gather these visuals for the
Sure.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of them, came from, real contemporary life, the things around me. But like the water, the ocean, the sea, that is very much rooted in the original myth. So Poseidon being the god of the ocean,
Hmm.
I very much felt and knew that was going to be part of this story. Um, especially like I mean, not to get too graphic or anything like
Mm.
that or potentially gross, but the salt water component,
Mm.
particularly as it
Yeah.
relates to,
Right.
you know, physical
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And
part.
right. It's got to be acknowledged.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
that for me, it was like too kind of. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think sometimes, like, when people created these like stories, first off, like, what were they thinking? Like,
Mm.
what could they possibly been thinking? Like,
Right.
I mean, yeah, you look at the ocean, and I guess back then you think, well, there's got to be somebody who rules over this thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's so
Yeah.
big, like, and so
Right.
so certainly, if you believe in many gods, then there's got to be one for this,
Hmm.
but just it's just, to me it seemed so um perfect in conjunction with the the kind of these stories about sexual violence, not perfect because it's happening, because obviously we don't want those things to happen,
Right.
but from the perspective of, again, you've got this sort of violent saltwater bursting, just,
Hmm.
you know, deliberately, in my book, made kind of gross and grotesque,
Hmm.
um, paired with this violent rapist god of, fittingly, the
Hmm.
ocean.
Yeah.
Um, so some of this kind of very much handed itself to me.
Hmm.
Um, and then there, again, the more contemporary stuff, like I had there was a point in time where I really had to kind of like figure out, like, okay, because I'm imagining her living close to the sea or on the coast or something like that, but also there's this sort of deserty lack of water component,
Mm.
um, that is very necessary and very contemporary and very much related to my life experience, that felt necessary and important. So I had to start kind of also thinking, like, rethinking of the landscapes, and like, okay, so like, where would that place physically be,
Yeah.
where you've got desert and coast? And of course, for me, California, having lived there, was,
Mm.
now California is not mentioned in Head of a Gorgon, but in one of the earlier drafts of the poem, uh, that is now part of the exchange between Medusa and Poseidon, the series of letters, that poem was set, um, in California, even
Hmm.
though I was actually drawing from an experience in Arizona. So it's
Hmm.
like, but
Right.
it's like, I need to kind of at least conceptualize a state that
Yeah.
contains
Right.
that would be within driving distance, and certainly that's the case for, I mean, California. You can be at the water, you can be in the snow, you can be in the desert, you can be in like any number of scenic environments
Hmm. Yeah.
within a couple hours drive, all in a single state. And so, um, that was obviously not part of the original Medusa myth,
Hmm.
but was something that I had to sort of kind of think of, like you would, as if you're a fiction writer and you're kind of conceptualizing a novel, you need to start thinking about and building out, at least in your own mind, a sense of place.
Hmm.
That was something that I had to do for some of the imagery in the background, um, for the more contemporary stuff.
Yeah, and that's such a great springboard because just to back up just a moment to the myth. I mean, you said something that was so powerful. I mean, by using this myth in particular, you go back to this perennial feeling, this thought of the violence that doesn't go away because that is ingrained in the species almost. And in some fatalistic way, it almost feels like this is something to always be vigilant against.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really stuck in my mind was you noticed a transformation in not just the protagonist of this work, but in the language of it. Right in that turn, that was so beautifully done, where the tone changed completely. Could you elaborate a little bit on making that kind of decision to switch language, not just completely, but in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for noticing, and again for all the kind words. I did want to say, yeah, I mean, I think it is important touching on your earlier point. It is
Mm,
important to be constantly vigilant because, unfortunately, if I'm still writing about this now, it means that it's still too prevalent. It still hasn't gone away,
mhm,
and there's still a lot of work to be done to address it. So yes, I mean,
mhm,
I very much you know, realize that truth,
mhm,
as unfortunate and awful as it is. As far as the language shifting goes, so I guess for me, the and part of the reason that the book took me so long to write is because I didn't have the answers until I did.
mhm,
And you kind of have to go through your own journey and process, whatever that looks like for you, in order to sort of get there. But I'm very grateful that I sort of went through my own sort of, I guess, mental transformation in many ways,
mhm,
to be able to come out on the other side of some of my life experiences and be able to kind of look at them and process them and sort of in a weird way maybe interact with them in a different way, um, that sort of, I guess, allows me to kind of just carry on with my life in a way
mhm.
that allows me to love myself and be happy,
Yeah.
whatever that looks like.
Mhm,
Um, so when I was in grad school and I first started working on this project, it had a different focus. It was really focused more on the retellings of the myth. And at that point in grad school, I definitely was not the person that I needed to be in order to
yeah.
finish the book
Yeah.
because I didn't I personally wasn't there yet. I hadn't kind of processed a lot of things, nor had I sort of experienced some of the things that had actually nothing to do with like survivorship, that I needed to in order to kind of look at myself as a like more like a fuller human being. Like
Yeah.
what does the sum of my experience kind of equate to, and
Right.
like what do I do with all that?
Yeah.
I hadn't, I mean, even at 29 when I graduated from my grad program, I hadn't sort of gone through some of the things that I was going to need to go through in order to be able to kind of ultimately try to communicate to other people that there is like something on this other side, because I myself had not reached that other side
Mm,
at that point. And so the shift in language is really about looking at one's experience from a different mental vantage point,
mhm,
because you're not going to be able to control what happens to your physical body like 99% of the time. And that's true of not just survivors. I mean, but that's true of just life. That's true of disease.
mhm,
You can't control whether or not you're going to get cancer or when,
mm,
if you do. I mean, yeah, there are certain precautions you can take and you can eat healthy and you can
mhm.
avoid smoking. You can do all those things, but even still, you might end up getting cancer. And did you do something wrong? Well, I don't know that you did, but here you are, and that's your physical experience now.
Mhm.
And you have no control over that in many respects. But what you do have control over in some respects, not all respects, but some, is the mental approach you take to it, the
Mm.
perspective that you bring to it, your attitude, and I'm not going to go all, a motivational speaker here, but because especially because my motivational speaker is like boot camp lady and not somebody that, you really want to hear from,
You're
believe
not gonna
me.
get hugs.
You're not gonna get hugged, sorry. But it's like I think From what I've heard and read from a lot of other survivors, it's like there's this want to escape the physical body, understandably
Mm,
so, because that's the physical is traumatized, and then it in turn traumatizes the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, all of that, right? When you have a moment, ideally, you have a moment as a survivor where you realize that maybe you could make a decision to reclaim the mental aspect and thereby potentially reclaim the physical aspect.
mm,
Um, it doesn't, again, it can't take away anything that was done or anything that happened,
sure.
but it can shift your relationship to yourself as a physical being, as a spiritual being, as a mental and emotional being. It can shift your perspective. And so for me, it was really important to see the language also shift with that,
Mm,
because it is a shift. It's a shift away from victimhood and this sort of connection more strictly to the physical and what physically happened,
mhm,
and towards a greater connection and control over the mental of who you are, the mentality that you bring to the experience, and what you can do with your mind to overcome and transform the experience of victimhood into one of survivorship.
mm,
And that is sort of like the fundamental, like, kind of linchpin that was behind this sort of shift, deliberate shift
mhm,
in sort of the language.
yeah.
So I like to think that it reflects a shift from the deeper physical connection and victim, that's often related to victimhood, to the shift into a greater mental awareness and control, um, and into survivorship, which then comes back and sort of encapsulates the physical once again. Like,
Yeah.
I think you can sort of reclaim both, but at least for me, part of that was I had to control the mental
Mhm,
aspect better than I was, in order to then sort of reclaim my relationship to my physical self,
yeah.
if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I want to thank you for your honesty there, and walking us through that, because it reminds me of this thing that you said. Because I was listening to the last interview we did, and this idea of self awareness was such a like a bright spot in the conversation, because I feel like for a lot of folks who are processing some of these things, there has to be that moment where you say, I am reclaiming my life, if it may have been taken away from me at some point in time, whether it's an emotional thing or a physical thing. And we briefly spoke about Head of a Gorgon, but I think that you really encapsulate just the thought of, okay, I'm at the right time in my life to reclaim this. And now at this point, because obviously there's a lot of different perspectives that or ways to approach this particular type of trauma. But for you, do you feel like the catharsis that came about in this book allows you to move forward? And we briefly touched on it earlier on, but I'm kind of curious what your stance is on the work and what it's done for you, whether you think that you're now free to move forward with a bit more openness or a bit more, um, I guess, pursuit of something else, let's say.
Sure, sure. It's interesting because I think, especially with the use of the persona and the use of the I, it very much kind of connects people in a good way. Like, it's intentional in that I wanted people to be able to insert themselves into the eye of Medusa, not the eye of the predators. Please don't be those people, because there are a couple poems that are from those perspectives.
Yeah.
But I wanted people to really be able to access the experience on that like very immediate first person level.
Hmm.
But for me, as the writer of the thing, like again, like my catharsis is like completely separate from this book. Like I
Ah.
had to kind of live life and do life and
Mm.
kind of handle my business.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I was able to kind of come and say, oh, okay, now I know how this book needs to end.
Mm.
Now I know what this last section needs to be.
Right.
Well, I guess the last two sections technically. But for me, it was about kind of communicating finally, okay, I have figured out a way to be happy despite. And now that I have figured out this way to be happy despite, I want to communicate that so that hopefully other people might be able to find that same thing.
Mm.
Maybe the book helps them do that, maybe it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of my hopes and one of my goals in doing that. So the only, I think, catharsis for me in finishing the book and getting it out there was, okay, I achieved my goal of at least trying to get the word out there about what one version of healing might look like.
Mm.
My actual personal healing catharsis was very much separate from the book. Now that being
Mm-hmm.
said, I started writing the book, I think on a subconscious level perhaps, to start working through some of this stuff, but the actual work of uh, that actual work happened for me off the page. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for other people it may be different, but for me it happens off the page.
Yeah.
Then I come back to the page and I say, okay, what can I share about my experience that might be helpful to other people, and that's the perspective I take when I'm on the page. But I don't think, I mean, I think journaling, for example, can be very helpful, and I've done that.
Mm-hmm.
um but I still think that the healing and the catharsis happens within a person, within their
Yeah.
mind and their body and their spirit, versus on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Like as soon as you put something on a page, there's immediately a distance because it's not an experience. Now it's a translation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even language can't capture a physical or emotional or mental experience because it's an experience, and
Mm-hmm.
language is something separate. There's an immediate distance. So it's already a translation of
Mm-hmm.
that. At least again, from my perspective. So coming back to that sort of like concept of, okay, well, what can be done then if there's this distance between experience and language? What can be done? Well, that's what I tried to do. Like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
so I had some healing, I had some catharsis. That was the actual experience,
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm going to use this language. And unfortunately, it's not going to be able to fully capture everything that I experienced and hope to kind of share with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to try, and hopefully, it does something. And here it is, the
Right. Right. Well, I think one of the great things about this was that you've been doing I guess the marketing circuit online. You've been making some appearances, and I had the pleasure of watching quite a few of the readings that you did. In particular, one that stood out was the one with Lanny Stabile, where you folks were doing the Greek myth remix because she happened to have,
end.
one book that's sort of along these lines, but you had somebody who was a mental health professional there, who kind of made some comments at the end that I feel kind of encompasses what you were trying to do, and she really did express what I think is spot on, that this is sort of like an invitation for somebody who is interested in exploring their own experiences, but not a cure for for something, and
Yeah.
I mean, I highly recommend folks check that out because listening to you read the poems gave me this added context. And I'm not sure, I guess I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Um, Louise Gluck made me think that maybe readings are not as important as they should be. I had listened to this interview a while back, sometime this summer, where she was talking about how she hates doing readings because it's like another iteration is lost right? On the
Hmm.
from the poem. But I'm curious if you share the same thoughts on that. Like if you think that that poem kind of withers in some way once it is read.
Hmm. That's interesting. And I hate to like go against like my all-time poetry idol. But before I give an answer, I do want to say one thing about what you were talking about, the mental health professional on that read.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so. Like, although I do very much want my book to be able to help people, like, need to make it very clear, like, everybody has to do their own work.
Mm.
Like, you don't get to, like, skip the line. Like, you don't
Yeah.
get to bypass like, that's the unfortunate truth about
Yeah.
about,
Yeah, for
like,
sure.
life, I guess, in many
Hmm.
respects. It's like, you can read all the books and you can educate yourself however much you want,
Hmm.
and that all that's valuable. I'm not saying it isn't,
Right.
but you still have to do your own work. You
Yeah.
still have to take charge and own your own healing
It's not an
and
edict.
be willing to, right,
Yeah.
and you have to be willing to do that. If you're not, I
Yeah.
mean, you're going to struggle,
Right.
and that's a choice too, and certainly lots of people make that choice,
Yeah.
and certainly for many years I made that choice.
Yeah.
So I'm not judging anybody who makes that choice. I'm simply saying it is a choice.
Right.
You may not realize or recognize that, but it is. Um, but also you need to still do your own work. So,
Yeah. So let me
well, I
amend
hope
my previous statement will be an invitation to consider because yeah, I do believe that the work is so powerful that it will raise the right questions for a reader who may have experienced something like this, but it's not an edict to say this is your roadmap. It's a consideration. That's all it is. If at
yeah,
all.
I mean,
If at all.
it's yeah, it's sort of like it's a camaraderie. It's a this is how it worked for one person
Mhm.
and may end up working for you, but you still have to do the work.
Mhm.
Like, you still
Yeah.
have to find your and this, this also plays very heavily into the book. You have to be your own savior. You have to find your own salvation. Like, nobody else is coming to do that for you.
Right.
And like again, while I do hope my book raises awareness and I do hope my book helps survivors in particular, there's the help that this book or that I could ever provide is it's a fraction.
Yeah.
Like, it's not
Yeah.
like, you still have to do your own work. You still have to find your own salvation. And that just to make that point.
Yeah.
Okay, now going back to the Louise book thing. I personally enjoy um, hearing other people read
Mm.
the poems. Um, in many respects, more than I enjoy hearing myself read the poems. Although I will say, when I read my poems, at least I can guarantee, like, they're more or less being read like, this is the way I intended them to be read. So,
Mm.
like, for example, the very first poem in the book, the Gorgon's Parting Thoughts, there is a very, very specific way that I have in mind for that poem to be read.
Mhm.
And unless you're me and you know the full backstory,
Mhm.
or you've heard me tell the full backstory, or you've heard me read the poem, you're not going to read it, quote unquote, correctly.
Uh-huh.
Now, that is just correctly according to me as the author, knowing what my intention was with that piece.
Right.
And,
Right.
and so ultimately, that doesn't matter,
Mhm.
because now the book is out in the world and the work belongs to everybody, right?
Yeah.
So so it's like, on the one hand, it's like, okay, so I know how I intended my poems to be read. But what I find really interesting when other people read them is what they bring
Mm.
to the poem. And that's ultimately, I think, part of the goal of literature is, somebody kind of brings a part of them to it as they read it, whether it's aloud or silently or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
you're bringing something like that whole coding thing that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
When I read survivors' work, I have that sort of I bring my own experience to it. And so
Mhm.
I feel like I'm seeing something different or maybe deeper because of that. Now, am I wrong? I could be.
Yeah.
I could be reading way too much into it because of that experience. But um I'd like to think I'm not, but a lot of people are going to do the same thing when they come to my work and they read my work.
Hmm.
Again, whether it's aloud or silently, but particularly aloud. When I've heard some other people read some of these poems, like my sister reads my poem Note from the Nadir really interestingly and
Yeah.
in a way that like I know her and so I understand like
Yeah.
I know where she's coming from when she reads that poem.
Hmm.
It's a very different place than I'm coming from when I read it.
Yeah.
And it's a very different intention. But it's like so fascinating and so interesting because she's bringing this totally different aspect to it that I don't bring because I'm not her. And I
Right.
so from that perspective, I think there's real value in reading the work aloud and also having others read your work aloud.
Mm.
Um, I will from time to time put different emphasis on different things when I like Lanny you pointed to earlier. She says, "Oh, I read poems differently every time," and I think there's truth to that.
Mm.
Like I yeah, like definitely, especially if you're like me and you manage to flub like one word specifically during each poem, which is terribly unfortunate, but yet seems to be the case for me. Um,
Well, I didn't notice too many
I
times. It didn't happen too many times in the ones that I was watching. So,
I've gotten better. I've improved. I give myself like a B minus now. I've moved up from like the hard D to like, C,
there you
like
go. There you
like
go.
end of last year, beginning of this year. Now maybe, maybe I'm like B minus. But but I can understand what Gluck is saying when she's saying, there's a maybe there's something now that could be seen as being taken away, but I personally don't
Hmm.
feel that that's
Hmm.
the case. I think that there's another, or maybe what it is, again, not speaking for her or anybody else, but like maybe what it is when you're adding that layer of physical, like vocal reading, you're taking away a layer that was that more silent interior reading that perhaps and certain poems do work like this where like if you're looking at it on a page it works differently
Hmm.
than it does when you read. So like for example, I have some poems in the book that technically speaking you could read as one whole but also in two or three different parts.
Hmm.
I'm not going to read those poems aloud in their multiple parts.
Hmm.
If I read them at all aloud it would be in those the main single, and it's not be like not because I'm being difficult or stubborn, but just because that like that's what makes the most sense. But
Hmm.
then on the other hand, when you look at the page, you're seeing something totally different and you're experiencing it in a totally different way.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe that's like part of what she's getting at. I don't know. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
again,
But it's a
I can't speak
wonderful
for other
rebuttal,
people.
though. It's a wonderful rebuttal
There's
nonetheless.
that's my thought.
I think that we could talk for hours and hours, and it's just such a pleasure to get to talk to you again. I just got a couple more to be mindful of your time,
Yeah.
but overall, I'm curious what you think has been successful in getting this book to the world in terms of the behind the scenes, the publication aspect of it, the work that you did through VA Press. Could you tell me a little bit about that process and sort of the key findings of that
Keep
experience?
on.
Key findings of that experience. Sorry, I went into.
Yeah. So okay. So I think part of what you're pointing to is I more or less decided that I was going to handle like my whole sort of marketing publicity
Hmm.
thing, which is another decision that writers have to kind of think about and make. Sometimes you'll end up with a press that might provide you with a publicist or maybe more than one if it's one of the big five. That is often not the case, and that is most often not the case for poets,
Hmm.
especially not
Yeah.
the case for poets. Even when your press does have a publicist, and this is something that I really kind of like, I hate to say it, but I also really want people to know and understand it. Like, I come from a background where I interacted with publicists and PR reps at like the highest levels. I mean, we're talking about like PR and publicists from like HP,
Hmm.
okay? Like
Yeah.
IBM.
It's your realm in a way. It's a zone that you're very comfortable in.
Well,
To some
it's
degree, wouldn't you say?
I mean, it's work that I've done. Not now, I was not that person. I was not that person at that level, but I say this because I need people to understand that I'm coming from this perspective when I make these statements.
Mm.
I've worked with like the best of the best in PR and publicity. I've worked with people who make six figures in that world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I don't think many publicists and PR folks in the literary world make that kind of money or are at that level. It
Mm.
doesn't mean that there aren't great PR folks or great publicists in the literary community, just that if they're really that great, they're probably going to chase the money
Yeah.
and they're going to make the money because they can, because they're that great and that talented.
Mm.
Okay. That being the case, with that knowledge that I have, I realized in pursuing, so I did outreach to almost 30 PR agencies and individuals
Mm.
within the literary community.
Wow.
So people who work specifically in there doing this work. And I ended up deciding to do it myself. Now, some of that is because a lot of these people, the minimum that they're going to charge you is $5,000.
Mm.
As a poet, you're not going to make
Yeah.
$5,000. And look, I'm not saying that that ask or that amount is unfair. It's actually not, because if you think about it from an hourly wage perspective, over the course of the amount of time that you need somebody to devote to your work to adequately publicize it, that's actually a pretty reasonable amount. Like if
Mm-hmm.
even if you think of it as like you're paying somebody $10 an hour, okay, but how many hours over how many months to a year
Yeah.
potentially?
Yeah.
That adds up really quickly. And I think a lot of people don't, they see the price tag and they go, yeah, it's sticker shock for sure, 100%. I'm not saying it's not.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is that if you break it down from the perspective of what goes into it, I mean, I didn't keep track of my hours because I knew I would just be
Be
devastated
depressed.
if I did. Because because I did once get paid to do this kind of work in part as a communications director at a university for a division of research and economic development. And so and believe me, I made better money than 5,000 for the project or for the work.
Mm.
But you know, it's just grueling. And people don't, I think if you haven't done the type of work, you don't understand just what it takes. I mean, you're talking about building lists, you're talking about cold calls or emails.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just hours and hours and hours and hours of outreach. Um, you're again, even just again amassing the lists. If
Oh yeah.
or you buy the list, then that's another money that that you're spending. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's got to happen one way or another if you're going to do the outreach.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do the outreach, and so I think a lot of people think, oh my God, like that. And okay, also, I want to say, in saying this, like, I'm also not trying to intimidate people. I really want you to know that this is possible for you to do. And in fact, I often teach people as part of my consulting.
Oh yeah.
Business. I will teach you, I can teach you how to do some of this stuff. And I'm happy to, because I think that more authors need to be empowered to do this, because they're not going to have a publicist be offered by their press, or if they do, the
Mm.
publicist may not be very good
Yeah.
or may not give two craps about your work, and you also have to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Those people may be putting in that minimal effort because they may not be getting big bucks
Yeah.
for their effort, and that you have to understand that that might be the case, like, and do your best maybe not to hold it against them, but if you want to,
Yeah.
then
But it's so
I can't
yeah,
stop
but
you.
it's true. You have to be your own champion, and you have to go
Yeah,
into this realizing that not everyone's going to give a shit about you and your work as much as you. But even though I tend to want to disagree a lot of the time because I want to be optimistic, sometimes that's the reality of it. A majority of the time
yeah.
is you have to fend for yourself in many ways. But I do appreciate, I want to give you a shout out for actually starting that series. I know that that you're actually doing your own behind the scenes posts on what you've learned from this. So I'm going to point people to that as well in the episode description, because it's very generous of you to just give out that resource as well, given that this has been kind of a, I was going to say Herculean task, but that would have been inappropriate given everything that we've been through during this conversation. It's been an incredible thing that you've gone through, working on this project and everything. But lastly, I just want to ask you, what is on the horizon for you? What's coming up ahead on the Raegen agenda?
Sure. At some point here, I am going to kind of wind down the outreach and stuff. I mean, in a lot of respects, I sort of have. The outreach isn't so much building lists as it is at this point, like seeing different opportunities come up in my various social media feeds. Oh, this person's got a new podcast, or oh, this I hadn't heard of this outlet before. Maybe I'll reach out to them, and doing it on a kind of one-off basis where I'll just, drop my post-release media kit link and, a couple words and see, what happens. But I do intend, hopefully pretty soon here, to get back to drafting the memoir. So I'm still I'm still 18 chapters in, but that was the case the last time I think I talked to you.
Yeah.
But that's because look, you, as a full-time employee somewhere else, you only have, I was working 2 jobs basically from October, November of last year up until, I want to say, like a month or 2 ago.
Oh my word. Yeah.
Because that's what PR is. Like, if you're really doing it justice, it's going to feel like a second job. Granted, a part-time job, but it's going to feel like a second job, because it is work. And so I'm hoping to kind of take that time that I was devoting to that effort and shift it back to, focusing on drafting my memoir again. But that being said, I do have a couple readings coming up. One, I believe, is going to be the end of October. Then I'm going to be doing a sort of like interview / reading with a colleague of mine from Las Vegas at the beginning of November. That's going to be kind of more like so I had the launch party that was really like fun and like what I wanted a launch party to be. This would be more of like the buttoned up, like professional, like fancy, I'm an author, kind of nonsense. But working with somebody that I've really enjoyed working with in the past, albeit not on a public platform per se. But somebody who his name is Greg, who I think is gonna kind of, because he's been a journalist and he's a creative writer, and so I think he's gonna be able to really shape an event that's going to be pretty interesting, and hopefully be able to give another perspective on the work. And then in April, I currently have in the works, it's very early stages, but I'm kind of grouping together a bunch of fellow writers who write about survivorship. And we're going to be doing an event that is going to be, I'm pretty sure, hopefully a fundraiser for at least one organization that supports survivors. And we're going to be doing it in April because April is National Poetry Month, and it's also National Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't
So
know
those 2 months, they're both things are represented in the month of April. And so I've just started like the early processes of this. And in fact, tomorrow I'm supposed to be getting on the Zooms with the folks at Only Magazine. So
cool.
They had a pitch, like they opened up for pitches of various different kinds of projects. And I had already started working on this, but I was like, it might be cool to get these folks involved. They had done a call for folks after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, for folks writing about abortion stories. And I thought, okay, well, it seems like they might be wanting to go in sort of like a social justice direction, at least to some degree. So
Hmm.
maybe there's a way that they would be interested in working with me and this group that I've formed on getting this reading slash fundraiser
Hmm.
kind of together. And maybe we'll do something else in conjunction with it. And so
Yeah.
I pitched it, and they wrote back and said they were interested. And so tomorrow we discuss, and we'll see what comes of it. But I'm looking forward to that, and just building more relationships. I think when it comes to this endeavor, the biggest and most important thing that you can do as your own advocate as a writer for your own writing is just the things that sell. Everybody's like, oh, nobody really knows what sells books, and yeah, okay, maybe that's true to an extent, but I can tell you two things that help, and that's building your brand if you are so inclined, um, but most importantly, building relationships. And a really amazing salesperson
Mhm.
was the person who taught me
Yeah.
that. One of the least smarmy, best. Like, I don't typically like salespeople. I don't think many of us do. But
Mhm.
this person who taught me that, his name is Brad. Brad taught me that many years ago, and he was right, man. And it works across the board in every aspect of life. If you treat people with dignity and respect, and you build relationships with them, and you try to help others, you'll find, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people um, will treat you in kind,
Yeah.
and help you along in your efforts and in your journey. And so I'll leave that there.
Oh, that's wonderful. I appreciate that note because that's a good note to end on. But I want to thank you so much, Raegen, for once again, this really powerful and brutal and beautiful work that encompasses so much, but also for being a really awesome supporter of Art's Calling and really like helping me get this thing rolling at the very, very beginning. It's been really a remarkable journey, and I'm just really grateful for your support and for being awesome on the internet and helping out, helping get the word out. Speaking of, like advocating and championing work as well. But yeah, anytime you got anything else going on, please feel free to let me know. Happy to have you on here so that we can keep chatting. But it feels like time flies. Like
It does.
time just completely goes.
Well,
Yeah.
and it doesn't help that I tend to be very long-winded, and that's one thing that has not changed since the first time that we did a
No, but
podcast. And in fact, I want to thank you because you know yours was the first podcast that I was on, and
oh
so
yeah, yeah.
you extended me this opportunity, and now we get to have this little reunion, and I was happy to help. And I just love seeing other people's passion projects just take off, and if
Yeah.
there is any little way that I can help, or um, you know, kind of promote other people's efforts, I really try to do that. I
Mm.
mean, not for bad people. If you're a bad person, don't reach out. GM's closed.
Yeah.
But but for the truly genuinely kind and enthusiastic, I could tell right away when we initially talked last year around this time that you just have this enthusiasm and vibrance for this community, and you've built this podcast. You didn't know poets were as thirsty as they are, and now you know. I'm happy to have made you aware.
You released the hordes of poets, and it was the best
I
thing
did.
because yeah, I mean there is such a need, and I'm really thrilled to be just kind of plugged into that community now because I've learned so much about poetry that it makes me feel like my education began this last year. And you were a key part of that, so I'm really thankful for that. It's been such a blast.
Well,
Like,
thank you. And I mean, really, again, getting back to that thing that we were talking about earlier about, people needing to do their own work and helping themselves. Like,
yeah,
I
yeah.
just like maybe let some of the poetry horde know about you, but you do all the work. Like, your success is completely the result of your efforts. Like, so please don't, I mean, I appreciate your gratitude, but it's really you, it's not me. And so you have so much to be proud of, and
I
I'm
appreciate
proud.
it. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Raegen. And again, congrats on this awesome work. Really can't wait to get the actual notebooks, the actual books, so that like I can admire the cover, which was brilliant, by the way. And we'll have to talk about that next time, that collaboration, because I had some questions about it. But anytime you want to stop by, please let me know. And yeah, keep being awesome. Keep doing your thing.
Thanks. Hey, reunion episode.
Reunion episode. Success.
Reunion episode.
All right. Well,
Thank
I'll
you.
leave you be. I hope you enjoy your Sunday, and let's chat on the internet sometime.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Raegen. Take care. Bye.